Hello friends and comrades, it's me, the magic disappearing act of 2020, and welcome back to Foundation and to our lovely coastal town. So today we're going to be finally doing the thing that I've been promising for the last 16 million years, and that is, we're going to finally focus on this castle. So this building that we have right here was meant to just be a little temporary placeholder for when we actually embark on the construction of a proper castle, and today is that day. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's get right to it. The first part we're going to be focusing on is the central structure of the castle, the big castle-y bit, which gives us the big inside area, also known as the bailey. We're going to start by trimming away some of those old parts over there, and we're just going to keep the little corner over here, which should work as a nice base for our new castle. I already mentioned in the last big construction video that I didn't want to just make a square castle. I wanted to make something a little bit more uneven and adapted to the hillside. I knew I wanted to use the mansion pieces, but I didn't want it to just be a monotonous, straight, solid grey wall. So I tried a bunch of different things off camera, and in the end settled on using the bailiff office in combination with a small extension to create little alternating sections, just to give the cliff side of the wall a little bit of diversity. The extensions help connect the whole thing together a bit, and despite the fact that they create some roof shenanigans, I think they add that little bit of detail that keeps it from feeling too samey throughout. While I was looking up various references for this castle, I couldn't really find one singular design I wanted to base the core part on. The greater design is loosely based on Hochosterwitz Castle, which I absolutely love, and we'll get to that a bit later on, but any individual pieces are just kind of loose castle vibes, rather than trying to replicate an actual historical castle. Also, one really obvious thing when looking at Castle Blade, which is a cliffside castle, is that they didn't bother making a wall on the cliff side of the castle. Which makes sense when you consider that a cliff is already a type of wall, but we're just gonna ignore that. This castle is just gonna be extremely well defended from any incursions from its own town. On the inner side that faces the hill, there's a little small stone cliff bit, and I could just cover that up, but I think it's a lot more interesting to work with it rather than around it. So the inner side is going to be sort of a rounded shape that follows that elevation. At this point I saved the game and came back to it a little bit later, and I noticed that every single blueprint that was placed before I closed the game had their height locked, and it couldn't be made taller or shorter. The bug was only a slight annoyance, and I got around it pretty quickly by just replacing the pieces, and I guess not a lot of people close the game halfway through planning a monument, so it's not exactly a critical thing. I always like working with the environment rather than trying to work around it. I love seeing this in the real world as well. I think a building has a lot more personality when you see those concessions that the builders had to make with the natural world, and I feel like that just makes the building a lot cooler. Like, you know that it can only belong to that particular place, and it can't just be replicated somewhere else. And I just think that that's really cool. I got so nervous with the height of the elements here, I kept tweaking them, making them shorter and taller, and in the end, I think I could have gone one taller than I did, because while by itself, a tall individual part may look very vertical and monotonous, once you add a lot of decoration and stuff, it just breaks some of that verticality up a bit, and the height really helps the structure stand out. So I guess the lesson here is, if you're ever making a big build, always err on the side of making things too tall. You can always take away from the height by surrounding the building with tall decorations to break up that height a little bit. Alright, so that's basically the core for now. It's a lot of pieces, so the blueprints are already affecting the frame rate. So let's just build this section before we move on to the next part. I saw that one of the notes for the next patch was improved performance when editing a monument. I wonder if that means they fixed the issue with big blueprints just eating your entire FPS. I haven't had the chance yet to try out the next patch preview, but after this video goes up, I'll definitely be taking a look. For now, let's let our diligent villagers get on with their work. Also, side note, going into this, I just assumed that Hochosterwitz Castle was somewhere far away, because most of the local castles around here are smaller. They were usually owned by less important barons, or even if they were owned by someone high up in the nobility, it was never their main thing. So buildings were usually more along the lines of manor houses, chateaus, and other smaller holdings. Basically the feudal equivalent to a summer home in the Hamptons. So I just figured that Hochosterwitz, with its epic style and cool design, was somewhere more towards the heart of medieval Europe, maybe in Germany or Switzerland. But upon looking it up, I found out that Hochosterwitz Castle is actually also known as Grad Ostrowica, about an hour's drive away from where I live. Definitely gotta visit it once this whole quarantine business is over. Alright, so this is going to be the core of the castle. It's a little bare bones right now, but we can populate it with various other structures and decorations later. For now, let's move on to the rest of the castle. When I was getting the pictures for the last construction video, I instantly fell in love with Hochosterwitz Castle. The way it sprouts out of the hill and incorporates the natural flora of it, I think it looks really cool, and I also really like the walls that kind of snake down the side of the hill, so I immediately knew that this is the vibe I want to go for with the outside walls of this castle. To replicate the feel of those various defensive towers and gates, I wanted to break up the wall with various structures, and they can then assume the role of little guard rooms, towers, or like a groundkeeper's shed. I also added a little building in front of our quarry, and that can be the quarry master's office. Then, to populate the inside of the bailey, I wanted to add some monastery pieces. For the purposes of this castle, the monastery is going to be cosplaying as a little in-castle chapel, and the monks walking around are also going to give us some roads around the place to make it look a little bit nicer. Later on, I do want to build a big proper monastery somewhere else in the town, but I figured since we've got all this empty space in the castle, might as well put it to some use. My initial plan was to put residential areas inside, but we know how finicky those residential placements get, so I just opted for buildings I can place manually. The wooden mansion pieces look really great as just little regular houses to fill the space, so I peppered the bailey with some of those as well. I used a separate Lord Manor building for this, just so it's easier to find and delete these pieces later if needed. Alright, our miscellaneous buildings are in place. Let's go ahead to construction. I'm still thinking whether it might have been a better idea to just put in a few residential areas and fully incorporate the castle as an extension of the town, but I'd also have to have a lot of workplaces, and then also a market, granary, and so on, and I feel like not all of those buildings might gel with the aesthetic vibe we're going for in the castle. It's not going to be a very busy castle, but I think it's still going to work. If it doesn't look that great, we can always put in a few tax collectors and move a few fancy people in later. Hopefully the monastery will give this area not just looks, but also functionality, without having to deal with the stress of moving people in and building workplaces and all that jazz. And it's also going to give us honey, which is a luxury resource, and we don't have a lot of those, so that ought to please our fancy folks. In the real world, honey was not really a luxury resource throughout most of Europe, because it was pretty much always readily available. But there is a historical link between monasteries and bees. Bees don't just produce honey, they also make beeswax, which was actually the more valuable of the two. It was used primarily for candles, which monasteries really liked using, not just because it's cool to ominously light up all your giant rooms with hundreds of candles, but also because monasteries were one of the few places where books were kept and read, but more importantly, transcribed. So having clear light from a source that didn't cause a lot of soot or bad smells was kind of a big deal. You really don't want all your precious illuminations to smell like pig fat. In addition to candles, wax was also used in various crafts, for wax seals, as well as, rather adorably, for making little figurines that pilgrims would leave at places of worship, and it was used in such quantities by churches, monasteries, and royals that England and France actually had to import it from Spain and Eastern Europe, and even from as far as Africa. The French word for candle, bougie, actually comes from the town of Bujaia in Algeria, which for a while was the African center of wax trade. So that means monasteries didn't really produce wax as much as import it, right? Well, because wax was such a valuable commodity, many monasteries stuck to producing their own wax to reduce the amount they needed to import. And if you keep a lot of bees to keep wax production high, then you're gonna end up with an excess of honey, which you might as well sell to help pay for your wax addiction. So that makes sense for the game. But there's a plot twist. After falling down this rabbit hole that this comment sent me into, I also found a 1995 study which cites that it wasn't uncommon for both lords and peasants to keep their own bees, and honey didn't really show up in a lot of household expenses, not because it was rare, but because, like vegetables, most honey that was consumed was produced at home. In 1350 England, honey was sold at approximately 7 pence per gallon, which isn't exactly a luxury price, and it was sold by the gallon, also implying that it wasn't exactly a rare thing. Not to say that any of this should have any bearing on the game, I just fell down a historical beekeeping rabbit hole at 3 AM and thought I would share my findings with you. This honey-coated detour, by the way, delayed the video by an additional day. I hope it was worth it. Alright, that's the bulk of our construction done. Now it's just for the icing on the cake. Decoration. Before we move on, the monastery pieces are already in place, so I just conceded some villagers so that they can get started on honey production, and I also added some honey markets to our town. That ought to satisfy our luxury item needs for a good while. Alright, let's move on to decoration. For the decoration, I want to go all out on the choices we have, using both mansion decorations as well as standalone ones. I really like the idea of having a little courtyard hedge garden thing with a fountain in the middle. I really like geometric shapes and symmetry, and because the castle is so irregular, I'm glad I got to stick that in there, just as a little counterweight to all the irregularity. I might have gone a little bit overboard with the number of wall fountains. While recording this voiceover, I just remembered that I completely forgot to use the little decorative herb bushes that the monastery offers, so I might go back and add those later in a future video. To break up the flat vertical planes in the wall pieces of our castle, I used a small stone wall to give everything a little bit of extra dimension, and I think that's actually my favorite thing that I've learned coming out of this build. It really made the sides pop, and it just added that extra little bit of detail. I highly recommend using this in your builds. Despite probably not being the most practical thing for a wall to have a little ledge on the outside that makes it easier to climb, but we're just gonna ignore that part. After adding some statues and other sundry decorations, I added some temporary... Do you mind? My cat is here. He's making noises at me. Should I just leave that in? Anyway, I added some temporary forester camps so that we can replant the hill's flora. I experimented a bit with the different tree types and ended up just cutting them down a couple times before just deciding that mixed trees look the best. Because everything's on a slope, some buildings, like the decorative fountain, get this really unpleasing uneven shape, so I ended up using the fountain very sparingly, and instead opted for a lot more statues than I originally intended. I do like this idea of being greeted by 2 statues guarding the sides of the entrance to the castle. You can tell at this point that I really struggled with what to do with the rocks there. I already mentioned I really wanted to work with that tiny rock section instead of covering it, but I also ended up really liking the way the decorative flower wall trim thing ended up looking, so I had a brief moment of panic here trying to make both work at the same time. By the way, let me know how you feel about the pacing and the amount of commentary in this video. I used to leave longer amounts of time with just music playing over a speed up, and in this video I tried to keep it a little tighter with a little bit more commentary. I also noticed that the middle wall was actually kind of aligned with the upper wall of our town on the other side of the hill. So I swapped out the wall type to match it, and I think that really made it a lot more cohesive with the rest of the town. In order to be able to add a tavern wall gateway, I added a little mini tavern in the form of a tiny kitchen in the corner. Side note, I've been working on this video all night, recording the various voiceover lines, and I just noticed that it's now morning because I can hear the birds in the voice tracks I'm recording. Listen. Alright, I closed the window, let's continue. After some finishing touches, our castle is complete. In case you're hungry for some stats, the entire thing took 11 game time hours and about as many real life hours. In-game, the construction of the castle took just over 2 years, which is quite an impressive feat for our little builders. The main castle structure, including the bailey and the outside buildings, comprise 143 individual parts, with the monastery, the wooden manor pieces, and the tavern adding an additional 39 for a total of 182 parts, without counting the individual decorations or walls. The maintenance of the main castle structure was surprisingly cheap and did not end up breaking the bank like I assumed it would, costing us only 702 gold to maintain, with the monastery adding an extra 200 on top. Compare that to the maintenance of our big church in the back, which has only a tenth of the parts, but actually costs more to maintain at 738 gold. And now, time for the big guns. Just in case you're curious how much treasury space all this translates to, I did spend about 10 minutes transforming this castle into a giant treasury, which I would not recommend to anyone because it scrolls back to top for each part you assign a function. Seriously, I had to alternate scrolling with the wheel and dragging the bar because my fingers started to hurt from scrolling so much. Do not attempt this at home. So, with all the pieces successfully assigned, the final increase to our treasury capacity was 30,060 gold pieces. That ought to hold us for a bit. This also bumps up our total maintenance cost, summing up to a total of 1,443 gold. By the way, I love this bit over here, it's so nice. This is like the guest house. That's where I'd invite all my friends to. And actually, one of the things that I noticed is while I was building it, I thought like the walls and stuff are already too tall and it's gonna look weird. But now I'm like, oh, I could have made them even taller. Everything could be taller. Like this could be taller and that could be taller and this thing could be taller. I think that it just kind of, when it's all empty, it just kind of looks very plain, and making things really tall, it just looks really monotone. But when it's all packed in, it kind of breaks that verticality of the situation, so I could have probably added a little bit more. But I'm still pretty happy with the final result. Alright, that's gonna be it for today. This video ended up taking a lot longer than planned, but I hope you liked it anyway, even if it came out a couple weeks later than intended. If you did, feel free to do all the things you do when you've liked a video, and barring any more interruptions, I will be returning to my regular daily upload schedule, including games like Dawn of Man, Ostriv, and I also want to start a new Foundation town in the preview build, which I was also thinking of streaming over on Twitch, the link to which you can find in the description. And I've just gained alpha access to a new god game that was just kickstarted called Fata Deum, and I'll be streaming that and posting videos of that as well. So hopefully, I'll be seeing you soon. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye!